When I think about where to start this conversation, where do we start the conversation about what does inclusion mean for children with disabilities? I believe it starts with these two concepts, with belonging and psychological safety. When we talk about inclusive classroom communities, what we're really talking about are places where all children feel safe and affirmed and like they belong. There's lots of different places that people might start this conversation. People might start the conversation by thinking about, what are the accommodations or modifications I need to make for these students who learn differently? And I would caution us to instead start here, to start with the heart of the matter, to start with belonging and psychological safety, which we'll go into more in just a minute. So as we think about belonging, the first question I want us to consider is, what does it mean to belong? What does it feel like to belong? How can we create classroom and community spaces where all children feel welcomed and affirmed? I've worked in education for a long time. I became a teacher working with students with disabilities, young children in first, second, and third grade. This was in Oakland, California, in our public school system there. I then taught in Missouri for many years, working with high school students, also with disabilities, and then with other neuro differences, including giftedness, which we'll talk about a little bit. Over the last, approaching 20 years, I've spent lots of time in schools and classrooms. Through my work with Mizzou Academy, I've gotten to be in schools and classrooms around the world. And they're my favorite places. My favorite place to be is in the classroom. And there are some classrooms that when you walk in, you feel it, right away, this is a safe and inclusive space. And I imagine that everyone in this room has experienced that. I also imagine that many of your classrooms are these spaces. What I want us to think about over the next 3 days is, how can we be intentional about creating that feeling of belonging right away for our students and their families? One of the ways that I think we do that is by being really thoughtful about psychological safety. So there's very compelling research that children learn best in environments where they feel safe, where they feel like they belong, where they feel affirmed. One of the ways that I work with teachers and students on establishing psychological safety is by thinking deeply about our emotions. Our emotions, so the way we feel, and our cognitive processes, the thinking work that our brains do, are not separate. So instead, we know from neuroscience that feelings, thoughts, and behaviors all lead to a coordinated response that happens across the brain and then across our classrooms. So we can see, for example, when a child is having a big emotion, that emotion is taking up a lot of activity in their brain that's interfering with learning. We can also see sometimes when children are having a big emotion related to learning, that feeling can even enhance the learning experience. One of the things I try to do with kids is I get them to name their emotions. Emotions are just information. They're neither good nor bad. All emotions are valid. As human beings, we have lots of feelings throughout the day. Our emotions can also kind of overtake us if we don't have good strategies. This is true for children with disabilities, though it's also true for all kids and adults as well. And so one of the things that I try and teach is to help kids name their feelings. So when they notice, I'm having a big feeling right now, my breath is very shallow, I've clenched my fists, I'm holding a lot of tension in my body. We work with kids to notice those things, to have a physical response, so to let your shoulders down, to take a deep breath and to say, what is it you're feeling? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling embarrassed? All of these have different nuances. And so the work of getting better at naming our emotions is the work of building an emotional vocabulary. What the research teaches us is that when we help kids to name their emotions, they begin to take kind of power over their emotional register, and they're more able to learn and to respond in the environment. This is a really important strategy when working with young children, middle grade children, high school children, and certainly with children who learn differently or have disabilities. I bring this up now because I'm going to ask you to also share with me some of the things that you are feeling. I believe that effective practices begin with really honest reflection. So just as I shared, we have to help kids be honest about what's happening in their bodies and in their brains. I want to do the same with you all. I think it's so important at the beginning of a training, at the beginning of a class, a unit, a school year, that we are really honest in our professional communities about our worries. So a few things happen when we name our worries, particularly when we do so in a community environment like this. One, now all of a sudden, I don't have to carry that worry all by myself, right? I've shared it in my community. We find when we share our worries in our communities that we're not alone, right? That if not all, many of us in this room are worried about what's classroom management going to look like in these diverse spaces. We worry about behavior. We worry about learning. We worry about safety. We worry about our own ability to teach all children well. And I believe that when we're honest, we can begin to set action plans to address our worries. And I believe that when we share in communities, we can begin to hold each other not accountable, but in support of working toward a common goal. Over the next 3 days, we'll address many of these worries. I won't alleviate them all, but we'll address them together. And I hope that this is the start of a very action-oriented conversation. So you can use your worry list as a professional learning list for, here are some of the areas that I just want to learn more about so that I can continue to serve kids well. I want to have a candid discussion about the myths and challenges of setting up an inclusive classroom. I want to include some resources for early identification for disability and developmental delays. And by the end of our time this evening, I hope you have a stronger understanding of some of the benefits of inclusion in schools and how this practice can benefit all members of the community. Our key terms for tonight are belonging, inclusion, psychological safety, and disability. I want to start with a case study. I'm going to tell you about a student who I had in my very first year in the classroom. We'll call her Louisa. That's not her real name. Louisa was my student for first, second, and third grade. She had transitioned from a program for students with moderate to severe disabilities in preschool kindergarten, and she'd come to my classroom, which was a classroom for students with mild to moderate disabilities, as a first grader. Louisa had complex learning disabilities, Turner syndrome, and medical complications related to Turner syndrome. She's also one of the sweetest human beings I've ever had the privilege to know. She is caring. She's a wonderful friend. She's kind. She loves art. She was my student not only in my first class, but she was my very first student, because the very first day that I became a teacher, the buses in our community in Oakland weren't working. And so many of our students didn't arrive to school on the first day, but Louisa's mom brought her to school. And so she was the only student I had on that first day. And we painted together, and her paintings decorated our classroom for 3 years. Louisa was easy to what we used to call mainstream. So that's when students with disabilities would spend time in classrooms that served only students from the more general population. We don't use that practice as much anymore. Now we use a practice called embedded interventions, which is much better. That's a practice where students are spending more and more time in the general education classroom. Teachers loved to welcome Louisa to their classes. And so she spent a lot of time in general education classrooms because she was just so kind. There were never any behavior concerns with Louisa. She was very respectful to teachers and to everyone. But she struggled with reading, writing, and math. We had a lot of academic interventions, and Louisa did make progress. Over the 3 years that she was with me, she learned her letter sounds. She developed some sight words. She knew how to write her name. She knew very basic numeracy skills, could manipulate numbers from 1 to 10. As you all in this room know, that's not our expectation for students in third grade. For students who are 9 or 10, our expectations are much higher. So when Louisa was in third grade, my classroom only went to third grade. And I had to recommend where would Louisa study next. And we had a couple options. There was no program like mine for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. Our school had very few resources. So we certainly didn't have a paraprofessional or classroom aide that we could assign to Louisa. So Louisa's 2 options really were she could transfer to another school and be in a classroom program similar to the one I ran for 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, or she could stay in our school environment, which was also her neighborhood school, and be with her general education peers 100% of the time. So you can see that both options had a lot of benefits and a lot of challenges. As a team, we had to think deeply about Louisa and Louisa's strengths. So remember, this is a student who has many friends, who loves her school, who's kind, who's happy in this environment. This is a student who's had lots of academic interventions over the last 3 years and made some progress, but limited progress. What we decided to do is we kept Louisa in her home school. We transitioned her to a general education 4th grade classroom, where she worked with a very caring teacher who was not specially trained in students with disabilities, but who loved Louisa, and Louisa loved her teacher, and she continued to make progress this way. I share the story about Louisa because I think it's an important case study on what strengths-based decision-making looks like. The quote on the board says, "When faced with complicated decisions, choose inclusion and strength. Love and high expectations can be a compass along the way." As our team, including her family, met together and really thought about what is the next best step for Louisa, we called to each other continually to think about inclusion as a goal, to think about her strengths, and to think about love and high expectations. Another strength that Louisa brought to my class community that I know you also have in your school communities, she was a bilingual student. So Louisa had recently immigrated from Mexico. Spanish was her home language and first language. Her family was navigating what the US school system even meant. What did it mean to live? We were in California at the time, to live here, and what are our choices? And so Luisa's mom, who loved her daughter deeply, leaned heavily on the teachers and school community to help her make the best possible decisions for her daughter. I know that you all in this room have a very similar responsibility to your students and their families. And so I wanted us to start by thinking about Luisa's story as we think about our own students and remember what are their strengths. What I want to share next, this is a short video by a school leader named Roberta. Roberta is a school leader at one of our partner schools in Brazil. At her school, they are relatively new to welcoming students with disabilities. In the last 10 years, they've really made a concerted effort to make sure that their school is an inclusive place for children with all kinds of disabilities, including more profound learning and medical disabilities. They have done a brilliant job in this space. A lot of that work I credit to Roberta's school leadership. And so as I was thinking about where do I want to start in these 3 days of trainings, I wanted you to get to hear from Roberta on what she believes is the most important thing she's learned as a school leader. And then as you listen, I want you to have the background that they are continuing to welcome more and more students with more complex disabilities into her school. So let's listen with Roberta on what she says is the most important thing she's learned.
Hello, my name is Roberta Mayumi da Silva and I am the high school coordinator at 4C Bilingual Academy. I was really happy to be invited to this metacognition showcase. Today I'm going to answer this question. What is the most important lesson I have learned as an educator? I can tell you that the most important lesson I have learned as an educator is to listen. Listen with your heart, with your ears, with your brain, with every part of your body. Students, they usually don't say what they mean. Sometimes they don't ask for help. So my advice is, the more you can pay attention with all your senses to your students, that's the most important lesson I have learned, okay? Why? Because you can capture the invisible signs. You know, these are signs that can help your students overcome their challenges, okay? And why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, first of all, when you listen with all your senses, you identify students' strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes they are not aware of their strengths and weaknesses. And you also help them overcome their challenges. They're gonna try their best skills, okay, with your help by making them aware of their skills. Also, by listening with all your senses, you can help them monitor their progress, okay? Other reasons are you help them become aware of their skills and strategies to solve problems. This is a very important skill in the 21st century. And you provide opportunities for them to reflect on their learning styles. Most of them are not aware of their learning styles. So by listening with all your senses, you will be helping them to achieve this. And why? Why is this important? Because we give support to students' needs, right? Each student is different than each other, so by being there, we're gonna help them with their needs. We incentivize students' autonomy and self-organization, so they can regulate their own learning. They will become responsible for their own learning. And also you can make them think about thinking. That's what metacognition is about. Make them reflect about their learning process while you are there helping and giving support to them. Some good examples are here in the pictures. They develop student autonomy. They feel more confident about writing, speaking, about organizing their ideas. They can use their creativity. Students are very creative when they are sure and when they are aware of their learning styles and strengths and weaknesses. You can help them have focus, perform better, have good grades, achieve their goals, and most importantly, the sense of accomplishment, the sense of being in a community that gives them space to grow and to reflect. Well, I guess this is the most important lesson that I have learned so far. I hope you enjoy and keep doing this as well. Bye.
In just a second, we're going to transition to the next part of the presentation, which is on dispelling myths related to inclusion. As we do, I just want to highlight one more time, really important point from Huberta. You must be present, believe in young people, develop ways to motivate them, and listen fully with all your senses. By negotiating and learning their strategies, students can be protagonists. So as we think about inclusion means belonging. Inclusion means that students are seen and known, that we're listening deeply to them, and that they are the heroes of their own stories. What I want to do next is I want to help dispel 5 myths I often hear related to inclusion. Myth number 1, inclusion only benefits some members of the community. So sometimes I hear from educators, yes, this is important work to do. It's noble work to do because it will help the children with disabilities to achieve at higher levels. Sure, it will help the children with disabilities achieve at higher levels, but as importantly, it will benefit all members of your classroom and school community. The research is very compelling that inclusive classroom environments are better for the learning of all children from across all identity backgrounds and lived experiences. These benefits are academic, so children who are in diverse and inclusive classroom communities learn and achieve at higher levels, all children, and they're also social. Children who learn in inclusive and affirming diverse classrooms develop friendships that are more diverse, develop more social and communication skills, for working and forming relationships and collaborating across different identity and lived experience backgrounds. So committing to inclusion doesn't only benefit some members of the community, it benefits the entire community. The second myth that I hear, and I hear this in different language, disability is a reliable indicator of future challenge. So if we know that a child has a disability, we can begin to predict some of the things that that child will do later on, and that just simply is not true. All children are capable of achieving at high levels. Throughout the next 3 days, we're going to talk about the power of high expectations. I often teach new teachers that students tend to meet the expectations we set for them. Too often, the expectations we set for students with disabilities are far too low. So one of the ways that we can cultivate an inclusive classroom environment is by remembering that all children are capable of achieving at high levels. I believe this is an act of care, and it's part of our responsibility as educators. Kids surprise us every day of the week. Myth number 3, disability is a deficit. We're going to spend a lot of time unpacking this idea in one of the future trainings. But right now, I want to dispel this idea that disability is always a deficit. In fact, children with disabilities often see and experience the world and solutions in new ways that make our communities more humane, more efficient, more creative, and stronger. In our third training, we're going to explore a concept called neurodiversity. And throughout the training, we'll explore strengths-based perspectives. More and more and more, across classrooms, across school organizations, and across industries, we are finding that we need all kinds of minds. We need different kinds of solutions and brains. I was meeting recently with our computer science teacher at Mizzou Academy, and he talked about the importance of having students in his class who can see things differently, who can suggest a creative idea that no one else has, who can see a solution that none of the other peers have brought up yet. We find that when we work with neurodiverse populations, so that means students who learn differently, many of whom may also be identified as having a disability, that we're able to develop a tapestry of possibility. The next myth, myth 4, is that inclusion only applies to disability. And of course, this isn't true, although our focus for the next 3 days is on working with children with disabilities. We know that inclusion runs far deeper than that. It's an intentional commitment to ensure equal access, opportunities, and supports for all people. We know that inclusive classrooms affirm and welcome children across cultural, linguistic, and physical identities. We also know that inclusion is an essential human right. So as we think about those classroom spaces where you walk in and you know that belonging and affirmation is part of the culture, that is true across all of these different identity groups, not only for your children with disabilities. Finally, a myth I hear is that disability is uncommon, and that's not true either. According to the World Health Organization in 2021, approximately 1 billion people, or 15% of the global population, have a disability during their lifetimes. Some research says that you can say with quite a lot of confidence that every person will know and or care for someone who has had a disability at some point in their lives. This means the students in our classrooms. This means our colleagues. This means our students' families. This means our school leaders, members of our community. Disability is not uncommon. It's part of the natural variance in the human makeup. And so as we think about curriculum and pedagogy and instruction, we have to also think about how are our strategies going to work for children who learn in all kinds of different ways. As we're getting towards the end of this first training, I want to spend just a few moments on talking about intervention, and I also want to talk about early childhood. Quite simply, early childhood matters, right? The things that we observe for our very young children, so 0 to 5, and then in those early grades, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, can help to set students on different trajectories. I want to be careful with a myth I hear too. It's not only that early childhood matters, right? Middle school also matters. High school also matters. As we're thinking right now about intervention, as we're thinking right now about identification, I do want to shine a special spotlight on the teachers and school leaders and families who are working with young children. And I want to say that you all, the educators and the families, have essential knowledge about your children's development, behavior, and learning. And I want you all to rest a little bit in that wisdom that it matters. When it comes to identifying strengths or concerns, what you're observing with these young children is paramount. So don't be quiet about it. If you see something that feels not quite right, explore that together, and it can make a lot of difference. Early identification and intervention can have a profound impact on development. So when we talk about early identification and intervention, what we're talking about are services and supports to help children. These can begin as early as birth to age 3, but they can continue throughout K-12 school, elementary, middle, and high school. These can include things like speech therapy, where we work together on communication, physical therapy, where we work together on motor development, occupational therapy, where we work together on life skills. In some school communities, we have lots of resources, and we have specialists who can come in and work with us on those things. In some school communities, we don't. So, I shared a little bit about my beginning as a teacher. And so in school communities where those resources aren't as available, we have to get creative. And I'll share as we close out a few strategies just to get us started in thinking about how we can support students across all of the different domains: cognitive, social, emotional, etc. We know that intervention is likely to be more effective and less costly when it's provided earlier rather than later. So again, to all of us in the room who are working with young children, thank you. Your work matters, and I can guarantee that the middle school and high school educators who receive your students see the care that you're pouring in to those early classrooms. We know that our neural circuits are most flexible during the first 3 years of life. However, through very exciting research in neuroscience, we also know that plasticity persists throughout life. So plasticity is how our brain can rewire itself. That's why we can always learn new things, even as adults. That's why sometimes for adults, it can be slower to learn a new language, for example, than it is for our 4 and 5-year-olds, but it's still possible. So what I want us to take away from this research on neuroscience is that if we're working with young children, my goodness, you can almost feel the possibilities. They're so tactile. But no matter what age you're working with, plasticity is still happening in the brain, and children can continue to meet the expectations we set for them. And setting high expectations is an act of care. We also know this research comes from the Developing Child at Harvard University, that ongoing or toxic stress, such as extreme poverty, abuse, neglect, severe maternal depression, can damage or alter the brain. These two things exist in parallel together. And so although the brain can be altered, plasticity also continues to exist. We also know, and I've underlined this, that positive early experiences, especially stable and healthy relationships, safe and supportive environments, and appropriate nutrition can strengthen brain development. So when I started the training tonight, I talked about the magic I sometimes feel when I walk into specific classrooms and I can just breathe deeply, and I see children who are belonging, children who feel affirmed. In those classrooms, Harvard University, the research from Developing Child, would likely say the conditions you found are stable and healthy relationships, safe and supportive environments. So as we think about what does inclusion look like in our classrooms and how can we best support children with disabilities and all children, this work matters. The work of creating environments that feel safe, calm, stable, and affirming. The work of knowing that that caring teacher is there every day and sees me and knows me and can name my strengths and knows my family can literally help to wire the brain in ways that prepare that child to learn at high levels. I wanted to close by going over some research from the Division for Childhood. This is the Council for Exceptional Children. It's the leading national organization in the US for working with students with disabilities. Here are their tips on promoting positive interactions and experiences. I want you to notice as you look down the list of these 5 bullet points that every one begins with the verb observe. So as I think about Huberta's lecture to us, the most important thing she's learned is to listen deeply with all of her senses. What she's doing is exactly what the Division for Childhood said. She's observing with intention. So if we want to help support social emotional development, we want to observe and interpret the child's emotions, and we want to do that work that I talked about with psychological safety of helping kids to name their own big emotions. If we want to help with social development, we need to encourage the child to interact with others, to interact with peers, and to interact with adults. We want that child to interact in diverse environments, which means we need inclusive environments that affirm diversity. If we want to help with communication development, we just started talking about the importance of speech therapy, particularly with younger children. Then we want to help observe, interpret, and respond to what the child is saying. We need to remember that children have important things to say, and they often say them to us in a variety of ways, sometimes with verbal language, which can be accurate or inaccurate, sometimes with nonverbal language. And what we can do as educators as we help communication development is we can listen deeply to the messages kids are sending us, and then we can help give them language to articulate those messages more clearly. If we want to help with cognitive development, we can observe, interpret, and respond very intentionally to how children are exploring and playing, and we can join in that play. I think that this is one of the things that our peers in elementary and early childhood do better than our peers in middle and high school. I think as our children get older, we sometimes forget. I know I've been guilty of it when I taught high school for many years, of the importance of play. Play is linked to cognitive development throughout our lifetime, even as adults. When we're having fun, engaging with content, our brains are primed to learn better. If we want to develop problem-solving ability, we need to scaffold the child's growing sense of autonomy. This is something that Huberta also talked about. So how students develop independence and self-regulation. As we close out for this evening, I've summarized this list for you, and I want to give you a challenge. My challenge is I want you to pick one focus for this week in your work with kids. Maybe what you want to focus on is paying attention and affirming their emotions. So that work of, okay, what happens in the body when I'm having a big feeling, helping kids to identify that. And then how can I name my emotions and building that emotional vocabulary? Maybe you want to focus on creating a space for many different kinds of interactions. You want to really pay attention to who your children, particularly your children with disabilities, are getting to interact with. And you want to widen that net to make sure that they're getting to interact with diverse groups of peers and adults. Maybe you want to work on language. Focus on helping students to label their needs, their preferences, their requests, and their interests, really listening to what it is kids are telling us, whether verbally or non-verbally, and giving them language to articulate that even clearer. Maybe you want to play and explore together. So as we just talked about, we know that when we're having fun, and when we're having fun, we're doing so in an environment that's psychologically safe. We know that we're more able to learn. So maybe for this week, what you want your focus to be is, I want to play and laugh with my students, and that would be valid and important. Maybe you want to focus on encouraging leadership and autonomy. Because our focus this week is on children with disabilities, I would encourage you as you choose one of these goals, that you really focus on that for your work with students with disabilities, and we assess together and we see what kind of a difference it makes.